So, Luke, when you were growing up here, what was some of the music that was in the air that you were hearing?
I'm sorry.
When you were growing up here, what was some of the music in the air that you were hearing?
I was introduced to rhythm and blues. There were three main stations, pretty much as multi-musical as the neighborhood was multicultural. We had Peter Potter's Platter Parade, which was very white and popular. We had K-Day. We had KGLJ, which was the R&B station. And we pretty much listened to everything. You know, we danced a lot to Big J McNeely and Chuck Higgins and Pachuco Hawk and that kind of music. But it was musical. I mean, it was, you heard it every day in one way or another.
And do you think that mix of R&B with pop, with maybe especially R&B that would then morph into rock and roll, did that start to influence the way that you were approaching music? I mean, can you actually trace some of your own career back to those early days?
Well, I think very much so. I think the fact that I drifted towards rock and roll instead of classical, yeah, it had a lot to do with the street and the kind of music I was listening to growing up.
And can we give Boyle Heights credit for Up in Smoke?
I'm sorry, wait.
And can we give Boyle Heights credit for Up in Smoke?
Yeah. It also had a lot to do with the fact that when I met Cheech, I knew exactly who he was, and I hadn't met that guy many times before. Yeah, it had a lot to do with, it probably touched in some way or another, it gave me either a basis or a soul or an idea of pretty much everything I did in music.
I mean, you've seen, in the space of your career, you've seen so many different aspects of the Los Angeles music scene develop and vanish and morph and change shape. What do you think it was? And it seems to me that Boyle Heights, in that, especially in that period, when you were growing up, had a fairly singular mix of styles. So, you know, because of the multicultural, you know, aspects of the neighborhood, the mix of musical styles that were living here. In your career, have you seen other neighborhoods in Los Angeles that have come close to having that kind of a musical mix that Boyle Heights did?
Yeah, I think throughout. I think it's, I'm not quite sure what you said though.
Oh, if the musical mix of Boyle Heights, have you seen it in any other form in any other neighborhood in Los Angeles over your career? I mean, is there something special about Boyle Heights' musical mix?
Well, I think the musical, I think there's no denying that most of LA music, other than classical, but even from the jazz and the jazz idiom, is influenced from what came out of East LA. I mean, some of the names that you mentioned explains it. And it went further than I knew. I mean, some of the names I hadn't realized were from East LA or Boyle Heights. I guess you went a little Lincoln Heights, Boyle Heights.
Yeah, people who were connected to Boyle Heights in some way.
I think it had a great influence, especially in the 50s, as rock and roll became more prevalent. But it goes across all genres of music.
It's really important to hear you say that, because I think so often in the history, the telling of the history of rock in Los Angeles or the history of pop music in Los Angeles, the West Side stories have gotten a lot of the marquee headlines and a lot of the kind of sunshine fame, and to get to that core that in fact maybe some of the real birthplaces of what we think about as LA music come from the East Side, come from the East Side, east of the river, come from East Los Angeles, not East Hollywood, but from East LA. It's really important to hear that, because I think that's part of the legacy of Boyle Heights musically, is that cornerstone, that foundation of so much of music in Los Angeles. Martha, I wanted to ask you, with your history is so kind of incredible, and I'm hoping if you could run through a little bit of those early years, because they're really quite wonderful. If people are familiar with Martha's contemporary work, might not know that as a young child, she was playing in major theaters. It was kind of part of the second or third leg of the Mexican variedades and vaudeville culture of Los Angeles downtown. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw growing up in terms of Spanish language music and Mexican music in East Los Angeles?
Sure. So my dad, like I mentioned, he's from Guadalajara, and my mom's also from Guadalajara. They met in one of the many Los Angeles ballrooms that a lot of immigrants used to frequent. So one of such ballrooms was La Alejandria, which we now know as La Alejandria. It's having a second wind now, and but it's a huge ballroom where they'd have big bands play, and they'd meet. My parents met there. My mother says that she danced with him once, and he never left her side, and so she's like, okay, I guess I'll marry him. And so soon thereafter, they started a family, and I'm the second oldest of 4 children. And my brother, who's the eldest, showed interest in music. My father was always sort of pursuing a professional music career via ranchera music, as sung through mariachis, especially on the mariachi ensemble. And so he would enter himself in different contests, and one of them was in this space in El Mercadito, where they used to like live radio performances of these contestants. And so my father was one that would constantly sign himself up and try to sing. So he was the original aspiring musician in terms of the professional music world. And when he started having kids, he said, oh shit, I gotta get a job. So he stopped doing that, and he started getting my brother, really pushing my brother in his interest in the music. And so he really tried to groom my brother to do this. And so my uncle was actually a music promoter who used to receive early Mexicano musicians from Mexico, receive them in his home, dinner. He would sort of organize concerts for them around the city whenever they'd come to stop off here in LA. So it was kind of like a variedad, that's what they used to call variety shows, where it was one house mariachi, and different Mexicano artists would come through, and the mariachi would basically accompany every singer, right? They each had their repertoire. The mariachi would rehearse with the artists maybe a day before their concert, and they'd rehearse their repertoire, and when the show came up, which they stopped off at the $1 Million Theater a lot, the mariachis would basically stand there the entire 2.5 hours and play for every single artist that came up. My brother was one of those musicians, and in the span of maybe 4 or 5 years, when this was really strong, as far as I remember, we sang or opened for. My father ushered me in later to accompany my brother and sing what we call segunda, which is like a harmony, right? And so I would accompany him, but we got to open for early Juan Gabriel when he was still getting started. I don't know if anybody knows who Juan Gabriel is, but Juan Gabriel. But also Lucha, an older Lucha Villa, Mercedes Castro, early Vicente Fernandez, right? Aida Cuevas, Adriana, I forget her last name. Anyhow, but different artists that came through. Resortes, which is actually an old 50s and 40s dancer, cumbia, comedian dancer. So anyhow, it was a variety show. They had comedians, and so we were part of that wave. And sometimes my father, the tour would continue into Sacramento, Modesto, and a lot of migrant towns, right? And so sometimes my father would allow my brother, he'd accompany him, or my mother would, and so we got to travel up and down the state, being a part of these variety shows that were really instrumental in sort of giving us these initial beginnings into, especially our own music culture. So as my father left when we were 11, unfortunately, but he really instilled that love for Mexican music. But once he left, we started listening to the radio, and it was over.